One night, a guy came to a bar and ordered a glass of drink and began to enjoy the drink. And after a few sips, he said to the bartender, "Hey, have you heard of the legendary Blacksmith?" Hearing such a question from his visitor who wanted to talk, the bartender was surprised to hear that the legendary Blacksmith was someone else. Hearing from his interlocutor that he did not know the story about which he began his story, the visitor said, imagining in his head the various weapons made by this character, the blacksmith who creates absolutely unique legendary items, and his greed simply knows no bounds. After hearing some information about the blacksmith the visitor told him, the bartender asked in surprise where you have ever seen a blacksmith who was not greedy, to which the guy replied, "You know very well that you cannot create good weapons without excellent materials, and it is unlikely that you will be able to get them without high-ranking comrades. But as far as I know, he has no patrons." Immediately after these words, the visitor confidently added that even the Tzedak Guild, which knew about his whereabouts, was eventually disbanded, and the bartender said, "What are you talking about?" Immediately after that, the bartender, surprised by the visitor's story, said in astonishment that this blacksmith was able to provide himself with everything he needed, to which the visitor replied, "Well, who knows?" At some point before the time when the legends about him became legendary, the same legendary blacksmith took part in a battle against a huge army of monsters, all in order to get additional materials for his craft. Ignoring the legendary blacksmith, all the members of his team joined the battle without even waiting for their comrade and began to destroy the monsters one by one. Going into battle with his comrades, the boy who tried to catch up with the others angrily exclaimed, "So they decided to give a damn about me and go ahead on their own." Arriving on the battlefield to catch up with his comrades who had gone before without even warning him, the boy jumped off the cliff at the foot of which was an army of thousands of monsters, and then said in amazement, looking around at all the demons and monsters below him, the boy exclaimed, "Wow, there's a whole bunch of materials for me." Taking out a sword from his inventory, the boy also prepared for a battle in which he would be able to get a lot of different materials for his research and creation of new weapons. Having destroyed a considerable number of enemies in just a few seconds, the legendary blacksmith confidently exclaimed, "I am the world's best swordsman." As he prepared to use his magic attack, he confidently exclaimed, "I am the best mage." But as soon as he said this, one of his comrades who was nearby tapped him in the side and mockingly said, "Boogeyman, what are you talking about?" Recovering from the instant attack of his comrade, who had already gone on to destroy the enemies, the boy continued his praise. Yes. Well, in fact, I was standing among a pile of swords driven into the ground. The boy thoughtfully said which one I should choose this time. Reaching for a sword that stood out from the rest, the boy said, "Just a mysterious blacksmith with a rather complicated history." Grabbing the handle of his sword, he said happily, "You are the one I need now for my first bad sword." As soon as the boy pulled his sword out of the ground, he was immediately attacked by monsters who were already a couple of meters away. And noticing this, he said in surprise that you decided to attack me yourself. Preparing for the battle that would begin right now because of the enemy's attack on him, the blacksmith boy happily said, "Well, that means we will test your effectiveness right here." At the same time, somewhere on the island of Kokoro, on the 4th floor of a dungeon with a hellish boss, players of one of the strongest guilds came to destroy it. One of the players in this cave was the 16th number in the United Councils of the Sharp Sword as well. The 8 top players who followed him and 200 elite players of the Silver Knights Guild were waiting for the battle to begin until the boss appeared, when someone in the crowd shouted out that there were 5 minutes left. Realizing his position and the power of his army, the commander, waiting for the battle to begin, mentally said, "With such a force, we could easily capture a small fortress, but I'm still nervous." Standing in front of the flames that suddenly appeared, the army commander nervously added in his head the 4th level of the dungeon on Kokoro Island, the boss monster that appears every 2 weeks, the Gao of Hell. Confidently standing in front of the flames, which were getting hotter by the second, the commander added in his head, "We spent so much money strengthening our weapons and also pumped our levels for so long, and they really became stronger after all the investment." After these thoughts, the soldier shouted out with only a minute left. Suddenly, noticing a stranger behind him who had entered the cave where they were supposed to raid and the boss, one of the soldiers shouted out an intruder, and the intruder heard the message from the soldier, and the nervous commander shouted out that, looking back, the captain of the troops noticed a man standing right in front of the entrance to the cave to the boss. Trying to figure out who exactly came to them at such an alarming time to raid the boss, the commander of the troops wondered in his head who he was. After assessing the physique of the guy who came to them in the dungeon, the captain wondered in his head who this weakling was. Continuing to examine the guy who appeared in the cave with a powerful monster, the commander mentally said in a surprised tone of voice, "Why the hell does he have no items but a cloak? He just walked through the defensive troops below." Realizing that his guards that he had posted downstairs could now be killed if this person was here, the captain nervously added in his head he was a well-trained assassin. Scanning the man's name to determine who he was, the captain saw the inscription grid in the system window in front of him, and he said in surprise, "No killer would ever give himself away so easily." The next moment, after launching a system search for the user, the army commander received another system message that said the user was not found, and he said in confusion in his head, "I don't understand, so it's not the player." Falsely convinced of his guesses, the commander thought that if it wasn't a player who could get in, then the guard standing at the entrance had relaxed. What a bunch of jerks. And then he immediately exclaimed, "This area is controlled by the Silver Knights Guild." Continuing to drill his gaze into the guy who had come to the cave, the army commander added, "I don't know how you got here, but we are about to start an important battle. If you want to stay alive, you better go back." Hearing that he had already been noticed and that the army leader was addressing him personally, Grid sighed heavily and said, "I wonder if my invisibility disappeared only because I could be detected by the infernal Gao." Immediately after that, reaching for his cloak, the boy said, throwing it off, "In which case I no longer need it." As soon as the cloak was taken off, all the players present were shocked to see someone truly incredible standing right in front of them. The very weakling that the army commander thought he was turned out to be a rather powerful guy with very bright and interesting armor. His whole body was covered with steel scales and his tail was still sticking out behind him. His armor looked like a dragon. Looking at the guy they saw, one of the soldiers said in surprise what kind of armor it was, and the other said, "Are you kidding me? It's unique. What's wrong with this guy?" Noticing that all the attention of his subjects was focused on the guy who broke into their reserve territory, the commander of the army shouted out menacingly, "Hey, what are you all looking at?" and took the impudent guy away. As soon as he gave the order, the dungeon boss appeared right behind him, and the commander nervously exclaimed, "Oh shit, he's here." Right in front of them was the very Hell Gao they had been waiting for 2 weeks to raid and get rare materials. When the enemy had fully completed his arrival and regeneration, a system notification appeared over the heads of all players, saying that the Hellfire Master Hell Gao had arrived. Immediately after the boss appeared, he used his suppression skill and another system notification appeared, saying that Hellfire Gao's roar had spread fear and chaos and weakened the player. However, that was not all. After that, another system notification appeared that said Hell Gao's flames had reduced heat resistance by. Continuing to make preparations for the battle with the players, the boss activated his own effects to make it easier to deal with the enemies, as a result of which a system notification appeared above them. Hell Gao used Pillars of Flame. The next moment, using another of his attacks after all the debuffs imposed on the players, the enemy was able to easily sweep away a large number of enemies. Seeing what had just happened as a result of just the first enemy attack, the army commander nervously exclaimed that half of the guild had been destroyed by just one flame. Preparing to take the next enemy attack, The army commander nervously said in his head, "I have increased my heat resistance to 86%, but I think I will still take a lot of serious damage." Resigned to his fate, the leader of the raiding force said in a disappointed voice, "We have lost again." At the same time, Grid, who had arrived at the cave, said oopsie doopsie and headed for Hell Gao, ignoring the heat coming from it. He didn't care about the infernal heat coming from the boss of this dungeon. He confidently walked forward to his goal. Watching this incredible sight, the astonished army commander said in his head, "Who is the flame strong enough to destroy half of my guild?" But looking at Grid, who was walking into the heat of the inferno, where the temperature was reaching high levels, the man said in his head, "This guy doesn't care." Having reached the place he needed, Grid activated his inventory and a bright sphere appeared near him. Watching what would happen next, the army leader held his breath. The next moment, no matter what anyone thought, Grid was not even going to fight the dungeon boss. Despite the absurdity of the situation, he took out a pickaxe from his inventory. Immediately after that, using his tool, he began to chisel something in the cave, and the surprised commander of the troops exclaimed in his head that it was a pickaxe. Trying to understand what was happening right in front of his eyes, the shocked commander said in his head, "Oh my God, is he just playing a trick or what?" Observing the rather dangerous situation that is currently taking place in the cave, the commander added that he was mining ore standing right in front of Hell Gao. Continuing his digging work, Grid said unhappily, dripping with sweat, "It's so hot in here. It's just horrible. Why is it getting harder and harder every time? Why does this ore only appear when the boss revives?" Not even realizing that Hell Gao was aiming at him, Grid continued to mine ore, muttering under his breath, "I can even visit the dragon's lair with this pickaxe." With a wave of his weapon, Hell Gao prepared to deliver a devastating blow to the impudent boy who dared to ignore him in his own lair. The next moment, the boss hit the boy with a direct hit, and the blast wave hit Grid with all his might to teach the impudent boy a lesson, even hitting the leader of the troops. Seeing what had just happened to the boy, the frightened leader of the Silver Sword Guild mentally said, "That was definitely a direct hit. He's definitely finished." When the dust began to clear, the guild leader said nervously, "No one could have survived here. It was simply impossible." When the flames from the Ular completely dissipated along with the smoke and everything else, the army commander could see Grid in front of him, who continued to stand on his feet despite the boss's attack. The guild leader said in surprise in his head that he was absolutely fine. The next moment, Grid pointed to the monster behind him and said, "Hey mister, can you do something about it? It was super hot, but it's only going to get worse." Hearing Grid's request, who was hot in the dungeon, the confused guild leader said, "Wait, that's not the biggest problem here. You're the one who's the problem." Hearing such words from the surprised man, Grid looked back at him and said, "How did you survive?" Continuing to ignore the dungeon boss who was heading for him to strike back, the guy confidently said, "Well, it's absolutely nothing difficult." Again, withstanding the blow of the Hell Gao who was aiming at him, Grid confidently said, simply put. Smiling happily at his interlocutor, he said, "This is all an effect of the object." The next moment, recalling his past, the boy mentally said, "I devoted several months of my life to this. I had to obey and do what I could at every stage." Running away from the guards who were playing with him to finish him off, Grid gritted his teeth and said in his head, "What the hell they were doing? Why the hell were they chasing me?" Losing his vigilance while running away and being inadequately trained, Grid was stabbed in the back by one of the guards who managed to get him. Landing on his feet after being wounded, Grid prepared himself for a confrontation to be able to continue his escape, nervously saying in his head, "Am I really going to die right here?" Putting Grid on his knees after a hard fight, the angry member of the nobility said, "You fool! You abused our trust. Even with a contract, you couldn't resist greed and self-interest." Looking at the man standing before him, the boy angrily exclaimed, "Asher, you rascal." At the same time, one of the nobles who had entrusted Grid with the important mission of finding the legendary object added, "I'm not going to lie. I had my doubts from the beginning that you would be able to handle this mission at all, Grid. When he heard that he was disappointed with his work and doubted him from the very beginning, the angry boy said, "I've been fighting for months for nothing. Don't you think I deserve to be rewarded for my efforts?" Hearing such words from his mercenary subject to whom he had ordered to find a legendary book that may not have existed, Asher confidently said, "Of course, I will give you a reward." Immediately after these words, Asher added in a menacing tone, "I cannot let go of someone who has so confidently and arrogantly trampled on my trust and goodwill." The next moment, calling one of the soldiers behind Grid's back, Baron Asher said firmly, "I give you death." Looking back at the soldier who was preparing to finish him off, Grid nervously said in his head, "I've been risking my life for the past few months for this mission. Who would have thought I would end up like this?" As he watched his death inevitably approach, Grid nervously said in his head, "I can't just let this go." The best virtual game in the world is called Satisfy. It is played by about 2 billion unique players around the globe. This game is a fantasy world that is so wide and diverse in its content that it is sometimes even called another world. In this world, the number of unexplored lands far exceeds the territory that other players have already managed to explore, and this place was one of them. This very place was the northern cave of the End, and the very legendary object that the boy was looking for to fulfill his errand was in the deepest place in the entire cave. A location that was simply overflowing with various equipment and objects that had been in complete peace for several tens or even hundreds of years until they were found. However, all this was only for a certain time when a player would definitely find this place and take away these hidden treasures that were waiting for him. Upon discovering the very cave and the very item he had been searching for 3 months, Grid, who was currently level 73 and a warrior, exclaimed with joy, "I finally found it." Not far away from him was the quest item of Count Asher, rank S, called the Book of the Legendary Blacksmith. Picking up the book he had been looking for so long, the boy barely held back tears and said, "It took me so long, any other player would have given up long ago." After finding the item, Grid spat out a grudgingly insulted, "Stupid quest. I couldn't have stopped even halfway through with all the money I spent on potions and equipment." Immediately after these words, remembering the very Count Asher who had given him this task, Grid said in his head, "If I don't get a decent reward for this, I will never work with Asher again." Holding the book he had been searching for so long, Grid said in surprise, "So I got the quest item, unbeknownst to Palladian." His reaction was caused by the fact that he needed a rather valuable magic item to open the book. Looking at the book and the requirements to decipher it to see the hidden information, Grid said in surprise that Palladian's eye was 1 minute if I remember correctly. Opening the description of the Palladian's eye in his inventory, Grid said nervously, "It is quite a precious item. The cost of high-end identification is hen seeing this." The boy nervously added, "Wow, it has risen in price so much." Grasping his head, disappointed with his position in the game, Grid exclaimed in frustration, "How much more money do I have to spend in this damn game? Why do they always rip me off? I've already taken a bunch of credits for this game. I always get the fashion." Immediately after a few seconds of remorse and self-flagellation, Grid reached for the activation button and said in an ominous tone, "I always have next month." After activating the Palladian eye, Grid received a system notification stating that the identifier was in use. Immediately after completing the identification of the received item with the help of Palladian's eye, Grid received a system notification that said, "You have received the legendary item Pagma's book." Holding the first legendary item in his life, Grid felt this incredible satisfaction, and also saw 2 new system notifications that said, "The book contains the secrets of Pagma, the great blacksmith who surpassed all human limits when used. You become a descendant of Pagma." The next moment, another system notification appeared. "You have found an item of legendary rarity, and your reputation has increased by 500. Grasping his face with one hand to keep from screaming with joy, Grid exclaimed in delight, "Wow, a legendary item." Inspecting the book he had just found, Grid exclaimed happily, "Who would have thought that I would get a usable legendary item with which I could get one of the strongest classes available?" The next moment, interrupting his joy, Grid sighed heavily and said, "Hey, wake up. You're here to get S rank. It would be quite stupid to quit the quest." Immediately after these words, raising the book above him, Grid joyfully exclaimed, "Or I can simply sell this book and take the money for myself. A legendary item for it can easily get hundreds of millions of won." Immediately after these words, recalling his work in real life, Grid said in his head, "Because I had accumulated a lot of student and gaming debts, I was forced to do hard work. Gaming was the only thing I was good at." Immediately after these memories, recalling the society that looked down on him, Grid mentally added, "But since I dedicated myself to this game, even my close friends have abandoned me." Also remembering the family members he had also lost because of his games, Grid mentally said, "And my family began to treat me like an empty space." The next moment after recalling his social position, Grid hugged the legendary book and said happily, "But now that it's over, I can finally say goodbye to my past life. Mom, Dad, sister, I did it. Your son, the slacker, finally won the gold." Pulling the book out, Grid exclaimed happily, "Now I need to sell this item as soon as possible, so that's the way to go." Using the exit function of the game, the guy saw a system notification that said, "You cannot leave the game at the moment." The next moment, Count Asher appeared in the cave of the legendary Blacksmith, and then a new system notification appeared in front of the boy, which said the quest of Count Asher's secret request changed to the anger of Count Asher. Bringing a large number of his soldiers with him, the Count angrily said, "You lousy rascal! You came here blinded by greed." Hearing a familiar voice near him, Grid nervously said in his head that Count Asher. The next moment, Grid saw a description of a new quest that had changed because of his actions, and it read, "Count Asher's anger. Count Asher has noticed your selfish intent to steal the quest item and is filled with anger and will try to kill you." Grid exclaimed in confusion, not understanding what he was hearing. Hearing the confused voice of a boy who did not understand what was happening here and why so many soldiers had arrived, Count Asher shouted angrily to his mercenary, "You decided to betray us despite the contract." Only Grid heard the reason why he was angry with him and shouted in a disgruntled voice, "Lies! Do you realize how hard it was to get here without saving face? You didn't do it. How would you know?" Hearing these words from his mercenary to whom he had entrusted the search for the legendary book, Count Asher angrily replied, "You can continue to make excuses. The guards will seize him immediately." And now we go back to the moment when Grid was on his knees and behind him was a soldier with a sword. Being in such a sad situation, Grid thought, "I have been working so hard for so many months to get this in the end." Determined not to give up so easily, Grid mentally said, "No, I can't just give up and get nothing for my 3 months of suffering working for an old man." Dodging the guard's attack, Grid continued his escape and exclaimed, "No matter what, I'm going to beat this quest. I'm a level 73 player, and I have some skills too, let me tell you." Looking at one of the soldiers who had already rushed at him to finish him off, Grid confidently said in his head, using the skill, "I will deal with you first." Shock the guard's shield. Seeing that the enemy easily broke through his defense, Grid nervously said in his head that he was shocked that he did not even affect him as such a thing was possible. After blocking the enemy's attack after a failed attack, the boy said in his head, "You've got to be kidding me. I blocked his attack, but he still took half my health. I knew Asher was a level, but I never thought his men were too." Looking at how many enemies were still coming at him, a nervous Grid mentally said, realizing that he could not win, "But I should not have started my journey with this quest like this." Shedding tears in this situation that developed at the end of the mission, Grid said in disappointment in his head, "Oh shit, everyone could have just left and died. Of course I knew that could happen. My luck was not enough." Immediately after these thoughts, the boy turned his attention to the book in his bag and said, "Wait a minute, but if I suddenly die, What will happen to this book? It will also disappear. Immediately after these thoughts, a voice appeared in Grid's head and kept repeating in a depressing tone that I cannot replay this quest and I cannot win. I will not even get gold for this item if it also disappears from my inventory. The next moment, reaching for the book to activate it, the boy mentally said, "Then I have only one option left and I can only do one thing." Seeing what Grid was about to do, Count Asher, who was standing at a distance from the battlefield, exclaimed in alarm, trying to open the book. "Stop him immediately." Activating the book and applying its skill effect, Grid shouted out, "Too late, you stupid bastard, now I'm taking her with me like this." Applying the new profession of the descendant of the legendary Blacksmith, the boy added insultingly, "You should have been more careful in this situation, you fool." When everything was ready, Grid applied the Book of Profession Change and saw a system notification that said the changes would begin soon, and at the same moment a bright light appeared around him. As Grid made the changes to his body after changing his profession, he thought to himself, "Well, try it. Who knows? Maybe I can replay this quest after getting the legendary class." After these thoughts, a system notification appeared in front of him, saying that all skills and characteristics had been reset. The next moment, a system window with new skills appeared in front of him, showing the characteristic dexterity was opened. The skill Blacksmith skill was obtained. The Blacksmith skill score was improved. The Blacksmith Patience skill was obtained. The Blacksmith Dismantle Repair was obtained. All the skills and abilities of the Blacksmith were improved to a high level. The legendary level of the Blacksmith skills and abilities was opened. Feeling the changes in his body after gaining the new Grid class skills, he mentally said, "I am now a working class laborer even in the game. Well, I just had no other choice, but I still feel quite strong. I guess it's a class effect." Looking at Count Asher, who was boiling with rage because his precious item had been used, Grid happily said in his head, "Seeing you in pain, Asher, is such a pleasure." The next moment, turning his gaze to the enemies who were approaching him, Grid confidently said in his head, "Let's start beating these dumbasses and complete this quest." Immediately after these thoughts, the boy saw a system notification in front of him that said the changes were complete, and then he happily said, "Everything is ready." When the entire transformation was completed, Grid, left in only his underwear on the battlefield, received a system notification that said, "Your level is now equal to 1." Immediately after that, Grid's cocky smile was quickly erased from his face with just one blow from the head of an Asher guard who was level 300. After receiving only one hit that barely missed him, Grid saw a white screen in front of him and a system notification plate that said, "You are dead." At the same time, an urgent call rang somewhere in the game developer's house, and picking up the phone, he heard that the task force report said the class change had taken place 5 minutes ago. Hearing the report, the game creator, who had been waiting for this to happen, replied in a stern voice, "I'm leaving soon. I'll be there," and was told, "Yes, sir. I'll start preparing the briefing right away." Approaching the door of his house, the game creator said thoughtfully, "So a change of class? Well, I wonder who could be the same. I'm already burning with impatience."